Hello, geography students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 15, Section 2, The History of Southeast Asia. So let's begin. So, in number one, Southeast Asia is the crossroads of the world because it's located along an important maritime trade route. Maritime basically is talking about travel by the oceans or the seas. So, trade has exposed this region to many different cultural influences. It's also made them prey to foreign powers seeking to increase their wealth and power by controlling these trade routes. So, when we talk about the time of exploration around the late 1400s, early 1500s, and into the 1600s, um, this is an area where we first saw a lot of people coming from India to trade with this part of the world, to also convert people from, kind of pagan religions to Hinduism and eventually Buddhism and then finally to Islam. Uh, Eventually, European powers are going to find their way to this region as well and are going to try to colonize different areas and try to develop kind of a monopoly on trade. Number two, the Sarajaya Kingdom began around the AD 600s on the island of Sumatra, which is in Indonesia, and they gained control of the Strait of Malacca, which connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Oceans. Spices were traded with India, Southwest Asia, that'd be like the Middle East, Africa, and eventually with Europe. The Jaya grew into an empire that dominated commerce. Commerce is a fancy name for business in this region for over 600 years. The pagan kingdoms also developed in this region, particularly in Myanmar along the Irrawaddy Delta. The Vietnamese society developed along the Red River Delta and kind of the Mekong. The Khmer is located and centered around the lake called Tonle Sap in what is now present day Cambodia. And number four, the Khmers were an early advanced civilization that lasted from the AD 800s to the mid 1200s AD. They invented a water management system to improve their crops, in other words, kind of like irrigation. They also built two very impressive structures, one known as Angkor Thom, and the other is known as Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is kind of located right here in the middle in this photo. It was a huge temple complex that was built by the Hindus that had come from India years before to bring their religion. And it was built during the 1100s. So that would have been like in European time, that would have been kind of the height of the Middle Ages. It reflected their advanced civilization, also their religion. Angkor Wat was dedicated to the Hindu god known as Vishnu. If you know anything about Hindus, one of the things that should be said is that they are kind of like polytheistic, where they have multiple gods and goddesses, opposed to Islam, which is a monotheistic faith. So, Islam, speaking of religions, reached Southeast Asia in the early 800s and 900s. This is not long after this religion kind of came to the surface. So, as a fairly new religion, they were trying to spread the faith pretty quickly. And they used traders from the Middle East and parts of Western India who were traveling sea routes to China to spread this faith. So, areas like Malaysia, a little bit of Indonesia, a little bit of the southern part of the Philippines, tend today to have very large Muslim populations. In the 1400s, Islamic kingdoms had risen near ports located along the main trade routes through the region's waterways. In the 1600s, Islam became the dominant religion of the Malay archipelago. So, one of the most important Islamic kingdoms that was centered on the port of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula was founded in the 1400s, where sultans ruled. And the man that you see in the middle there, that's kind of an example of a sultan. And when you look at the map on the left-hand side, the government of a sultan is known as a sultanate. And this is the one sultanate that you would have seen back in the 1400s for the Malacca Strait. So, from ancient times to the Middle Ages, spices from Southeast Asia had reached Europe through Chinese, Indian, and eventually Arab traders. Some of the European spices that were kind of, coveted were ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace. All of these to flavor and preserve meat, and to make perfumes and medicines. Some of these spices were valued more than gold at various times. So this was a huge moneymaker for a lot of traders, and eventually Europeans are going to decide that they're ready to make these trips around the Horn of Africa, perhaps maybe even the southern point of Africa to trade. So, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator, led a Spanish expedition that was the first to sail around the world, reaching the Philippines. Now, the sad story is Magellan, who kind of gets a lot of recognition for this. He discovers the Strait of Magellan, which is at the southern point of the South American continent, but unfortunately, he never made it back home because he died. But the Spanish decided to make the Philippines a colony, and they eventually brought Roman Catholicism to the Philippines. And even today, many Filipinos are Catholic, and if they're not Catholic, a lot of them are Christian. And number 11, between the 1600s and the 1700s, Dutch traders drove the Portuguese out of the region, except for the very small island of Timor. The Dutch were able to gain control of the tea and eventually the spice trade on what became known as the Dutch East Indies, aka Indonesia. In 1898, the United States took possession of the Philippines after winning what it was called the Spanish American War, aka the Splendid Little War. We would keep the Philippines for a number of years. Matter of fact, there was a time after we had taken possession in 1898 that the Filipinos tried to have a war of independence, and they didn't get very far. They were defeated. So the United States would keep possession of the Philippines until World War II, and after World War II in 1946, we handed back the Philippines to the Filipino people. In between 1939 and 1945, during World War II, the Japanese occupied most of Southeast Asia in search of needed resources. And when the war was over, this land would go back to its imperial powers. What do we mean by that? That means the Europeans who had colonized this region over the years, the French, eventually the United States, some of the Dutch, and whatnot. So, number 14, French Indochina, which is this region right over here, would be faced with a bloody war with France, who had colonized it years before. And at some point in time, the French superpower would be defeated. And so in 1954, the French left Indochina, and they decided through a treaty to split this area into different countries. So you have the beginning of Laos, Cambodia, and then Vietnam, which was kind of split on the issue of how they were going to be governed. In the northern part of Vietnam, even though it says Democratic Republic of Vietnam, this was a communist country. And in the south, you have South Vietnam, which was a country that was, I would say, friendly to the United States, but I wouldn't call it a complete democracy by any means. All right. Number 15, Siam, or aka present day Thailand, was the only country in Southeast Asia that the Europeans did not colonize. It was ruled by an absolute monarch from the mid 1300s to about 1932. And over the years, Siam faced attacks or threats from Burma, Great Britain, and other Western countries. Number 16, Ho Chi Minh, the man that you see pictured below with the kind of the wiry goatee. He was a Vietnamese communist statesman who fought the Japanese during World War II. And when the Japanese were defeated, he thought that he was going to get his independence and have his own nation. That didn't happen until after the French had kind of been defeated by Ho and some of his men. Um, he would become the leader of North Vietnam, a communist country, and eventually the leader of the North Vietnamese during the height of the Vietnam War. It should be stated that he did not live long enough to see the end of the war. He died of old age before the war was ended. But for the most part, he is still seen as this great hero of the Vietnam War. And since we're talking Vietnam War, it began when the communists took control of North Vietnam, and eventually the South was allied to the U.S. in 1954. Civil war broke out in the South, and to defend South Vietnam from the communists, the United States sent troops starting in the early 1960s. This was based on the idea of the domino theory, which was kind of a theory that we held on to here in the United States throughout the Cold War. An idea was if one nation fell to communism, the rest were likely to topple as well. Hence why we got involved in a lot of wars during that period of time. Years after the Vietnam War, after 1975, caused death and destruction in Vietnam. They were actually fighting a civil war for a period of time after we had withdrawn there. And North and South Vietnam would unify as a communist country in 1975. Over a million refugees of the war came to the United States during the 1970s and 80s to escape, you know, probably perceived persecution, especially if they sided with the United States during the war. Civil wars raged in Cambodia and Laos, and in 1975, the communists took over both nations. Pol Pot became the leader of what was known as the Khmer Rouge. Rouge is actually a French word for red, and if you know anything about communists, they tend to use red as a kind of a color that's symbolic of their communist movement. Uh, Pol Pot and some of his followers, they terrorized people, resulting in the death of more than a million people in what was known as the Killing Field, which was a genocide that happened during this period of time. One of the things that should be mentioned is that Pol Pot really wanted to go back to the old way of doing things, and he wanted people to be able to farm and to be peasants. And so anybody who was educated was persecuted. And matter of fact, anybody who had a college education was probably put into one of these death camps where they were eventually annihilated. So this event sparked further fighting that would continue off and on throughout the mid 1990s. Singapore, it gained its independence from Great Britain in 1959 and then from Malaysia in 1965 and is one of the world's most prosperous nations. Thailand has been a constitutional monarchy since 1932, and its monarch is legally bound by a constitution and their government. It's kind of like Great Britain in a sense. It has faced many challenges during the early 1900s, but by 1980, it had instituted democratic reforms and has grown its economy. Thank you so much.